This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hey guys, the Structure of Story is now open. This is a Storyworks Fiction nuts and bolts course, and it's all about structure. Because often structure isn't taught. People assume it's just a natural byproduct of writing. Like, if you write a story, you'll intuitively know how long to make your scenes, where to place chapter breaks, and how to maximize the effects of dramatic or comedic action. But that really isn't true. Yes, literature is an art form, but like all other art forms, it springs from a definite working knowledge of craft. By learning the mechanics of story structure, you'll be able to identify the key elements of your story, shape them to increase your story's desired effect on your readers, and turn craft concepts into tools that you have at your disposal whenever you sit down to write. You can find out more about the structure of story and preview 2 of the modules, including 3.2, which is all about chapters, at storyworksfiction.com. This course is open, it's live, it's ready to enroll. Head over to storyworksfiction.com, get the preview, and hopefully I'll see you in the classroom. All right, enjoy this week's show. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Robert and I have J Thorn with us today. J is a top 100 most popular author in horror, science fiction, action and adventure, and fantasy. And this is our companion episode, so if you haven't already heard our first episode with J Thorn, go back to storyworkspodcast.com, find it. It's great. We get deep into dystopian and post-apocalyptic fiction. Now, today we are discussing world building in those genres, and I just really want to know, how many ways can you actually end the world? This is
and we're still here as well, so clearly it didn't end between this episode and the last one, so that's good news.
Thank goodness.
For everybody listening.
Yes.
Yeah. Or if you're not able to listen, then it already has happened.
Right, yeah. Yes, so welcome back, Jay. We are very happy to have you here, and we're going to go deeper into these worlds.
Yeah, I'm excited to continue the conversation we started last episode.
Yeah, me too. So what does world building entail in both of these genres? We can start with either dystopian or post-apocalyptic, whichever you prefer.
Yeah, I think, in this case, I think the world building is very similar for dystopian and post-apocalyptic. Now, you can have dystopian settings that are either contemporary or futuristic. They can even take place in fantastic worlds or other planets. So in that case, they're a little bit different. But it's funny, like the post-apocalyptic. It's a bit of a misnomer because on the surface it feels like, well, you don't need to build a world because there isn't one that exists. But from a craft perspective, there is a world, and
oh yes.
And I think you have to be, especially with post-apocalyptic, anything that is at all science-based, you've got to really put some thought into the world building. You need to, if it's not on the page or you don't explicitly say it, you need to be able to justify the world that you're building based on the apocalyptic scenario that you've created. Right. And if you don't do that, you run the risk of pulling the reader out of the story, and that's not something you want to do. That being said, you do get a little bit of liberty because you're talking about a fictional world as opposed to sort of a contemporary piece of literature. But there's world building that goes, and I will say too that my preference, both for reading and for writing, is character driven story. So right. I don't start with the world building document and then come up with the story. I start with the story and then I put the characters into that world, and right. That's just my approach. And I know that, like, you look at something like Lord of the Rings is a perfect example. It's one everyone understands. that is a highly complex, detailed, extensive world. And yes, the story's character driven, but the world is really important in that. And I think you know with epic fantasy, especially, that tends to be the case where you know authors create entire languages and races and you know, and I don't think it's that extensive in post-apocalyptic and dystopian. I think the setting has to be well thought out, and it has to be rich, and it has to be detailed, but it doesn't have to go to the degree that that epic fantasy does, for example.
How do you treat plot points that turn on the key aspects of the world that might be different? So, say for example, there are no cell phones, or you know, there's no fuel available, or water runs out, or the water is polluted. That's a fine line, I think, anyway, always between making the science believable and not having the reader question why, but still keeping it character driven. Yet it might be a fundamental part of the plot. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. It's funny you mentioned water because Zach and I have a series called Barren, which is a post-apocalyptic series, and it's set in a world where the natural water sources are highly contaminated. Yes. And you know, I think for me personally, what it comes down to is coming up with something challenging for the characters that's believable. It doesn't have to be 100% realistic. It just has to be believable.
Yeah.
And I think now, I mean, this is so current. You know, we're seeing what's happening in South Africa.
Yeah.
We're seeing what's happening in a lot of third world countries, and people who live along seashores worldwide. Water is an issue. Clean, fresh water for a lot of people is a serious threat, and or lack of is a serious threat. So I think, like, you know, for Barren, what we did is we created a world where the water is the most precious resource, and it's not cash or gold or metals or alloys. It's water, and I think a reader can believe that, and they can think like, wow, if I turned on my tap and nothing came out, water would become really important to me very quickly.
Yeah, within 3 days.
Well, there is exactly that. I mean, there are so many everyday things now that we are so interconnected and so dependent on almost everything. We're dependent on a bigger organization for almost everything, and almost no one apart from the preppers are self-organized. So, you know, almost anything's believable in that sense, isn't it? You could say, well, okay, the internet goes down. Well, it doesn't bother me for an hour or two, but you know, if it's for 5 days, all of a sudden the power stations are gone and I can't do my banking, and you know, things get worse and worse. So I guess it doesn't have to be a major thing sometimes, but contaminated water worldwide is obviously a major thing.
Yeah, and there are examples of stories with fans, massive followings where the science doesn't hold up, and I almost feel like, you know what, it's not fair. If that was an Amazon book, the reviewers would be, you know, slaying it. But like, you know, The Walking Dead, which I've been a fan of, I watched the first episode the night it aired, and I've watched it and gone through phases, but you know, it's a pretty known scientific fact that the gasoline degrades rather quickly over time, and if we were 5 or 6 or 7 years out from a lack of production of petrol, that gas wouldn't work. I mean, I leave gasoline in my lawnmower over the winter, and it won't start in the spring.
You got to clean out the car.
You know, and the fact that like these characters just jump in cars and they're driving around and they start, and it's like. You know, that's a big leap of reality, I think, and maybe that has something to do with the medium. I feel like television and film, fans of that medium tend to be far more forgiving than readers. I feel like readers hold authors to a different level of accountability than those other mediums, but that could just be my opinion.
Well, I reckon it comes back to what you're saying about character, though, because you know you watch a TV show for character because otherwise it's a documentary.
Yeah,
you know, and maybe as writers, that's a good lesson to take. Is that, you know, don't get bogged down in explaining why the fuel still works. You know, 7 years out, just get on with the, you know, carrying the reader forward in the character's actions and entrapping them in that, entrancing them with it.
Yeah, and the one technique that I've tried using, and you know, it's craft is always ever improving. You never get there. You're always working at it.
Yeah.
One of the things I've really tried to improve upon is trying to think beyond the obvious and think, what would the reader question? And that's hard, and you don't always get it. But if I were a reader coming to this story, what would be my concerns about the believability aspect? And then in the story, hitting those head on, as opposed to creating ways around them, like acknowledge it. And you can do that through dialogue. You can do that through some backstory, but just sort of put them right out there so that the reader understands, okay, here's the rules of the story.
Yes.
And if you do that early on, then you have a choice as a reader. You can go, okay, I'm going to take that leap with you, or I'm not. As opposed to, making that decision at 50 or 60% into the book.
Right. Yeah, I call that anticipating your reader's objections and knowing where is that plausibility going to be questioned. And sometimes you're right on. You've got the science right or the history right or whatever is appropriate for your genre. But if your, intelligent reader maybe isn't familiar with that aspect of science or technology or history, they're going to go, that doesn't make sense.
True.
So whether you're making a leap of logic or are dead on, you still need to anticipate that it might not come across as plausible. So then, as you were saying, just insert some little snippet of narrative or dialogue or whatever to cover that.
Yeah.
Do you
and there's some... Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, do you find yourself being especially conscientious of this as you write? Because especially in post-apocalyptic fiction, you're going from the reader's known world to something sort of built on top of that or on the wreckage of that. So, you have things like cell phones and water supplies, and readers will maybe be more entrenched in their ideas about what things should look like than in other genres.
Yeah, I'll tell you one of the biggest mistakes I made pretty early on. It's funny now. I think of myself as sort of the old guard of the self-publishing revolution. It's been like 9 years. I haven't been at this for 25 years or anything. But one of the mistakes that I made very early on, and 9 years later, I'm just starting to rectify it. I'm rewriting an old novel, but I wrote a post-apocalyptic novel. And the flavor that I enjoy and that I write is not it's not military. So there's it's fun, like it's become so fragmented that you almost have different flavors of post-apoc, and so you have military post-apoc, and for that reader, like they care about like the weapons and the caliber of the ammunition and what the person's carrying, and like
and the ranks.
Yeah, and and that's not the type of story I like to tell. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just not my thing. And early on, I had some military aspect to this one story that I wrote, but I know nothing about guns. I know nothing about military weapons, and I should have done some research, or I should have told the story a different way. And what happened, once the readers started finding it, like it was showing up in reviews and like, what's this guy talking about? This, like, they retired this all-terrain vehicle like 30 years ago, and this gun doesn't have a safety, and you're like, wow. And I blew it. Like I should have known that, or I should have avoided it. And so I think it is a fine line. Like cell phones are ubiquitous, and I think that's a different type of challenge.
Right.
But if you're getting into sort of specialized elements of the storytelling, whether it's post-apocalyptic or some other genre, like there's a certain baseline of research and knowledge that you owe it to the reader to do before you craft that world.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a good point, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, we've become a very informed readership base. It's very easy, even in the Kindle reader now, to tap on a word and it'll explain it to you, and you go, oh, no, that's not what it says in Wikipedia, which is the authority.
And it doesn't have to be book research necessarily. One of the things that I did for the Baron series, we were talking about earlier about the post-apoc with the water issue. I live in Cleveland, which sits on Lake Erie, one of the Great Lakes in the United States. And my neighbor across the street has a sailboat, and he's on every summer. He's on the lake a lot. And I had this idea for the story, and I said it's my unique twist on this is putting this post-apocalyptic story on a lake. And there's islands off of Lake Erie, and in the wintertime it freezes, and you can drive tractor trailers across the lake to the islands.
Wow.
And these really unique aspects to the world itself. And so I bought him coffee, and we sat down for 2 hours, and I recorded the conversation, and I asked him all the questions I would as a reader about sailing, and what'd you do here, and how does this work, and then I was really fortunate. This was a few years ago before he got really busy, but Hugh Howey is a big deal in the indie publishing world, and he sails all around the world, and I was able to send him the first couple chapters and say, I've never lived on a boat. I don't know anything about it, but what do you think? And kind of get some validation from him that said, yeah, that seems pretty good. So there are different ways. I even went to a boat show in Cleveland. They had every February, I think it is. They have a big boat show in the indoor convention center, and I went and I walked through 15, 20 different boats, and I talked to the owners, and I talked to the people on the floor, and all of that, I like to think, added some texture to the story that it would have been hard to get from Wikipedia or from Google.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and that raises such a great point that even when you're writing a setting that doesn't exist in our world, like science fiction, another planet or post-apocalyptic or something, there's so much we can do in terms of legwork, actual physical, tactile, real experiences that will then enrich that world we're building on the page for our readers. I think that's so cool.
Yeah, I mean, in my example, I also spent time walking along the lake. I walked the parks. I walked past the yacht club. I drove. There's 4 or 5 different beaches within driving distance of where I live. I went to all of them. I went at different times of the year, and you're right. I think experiencing that, and we talked a little about in the previous episode about sort of what your own experience can bring to the story. I think looking around and seeing where you live or how you live, and leveraging that in a way that gives you that unique twist is something everyone can do.
Right.
So when then it comes to post-apocalyptic, the difference, I guess, with dystopian is that your descriptive elements are going to be based around the bodies and the oppression and the politics. In post-apocalyptic, does the reader, what sort of description is the reader expecting of the post-apocalyptic landscape? We talk about world building. How much of that needs to be in there? Do they want to see? Do they want to see, hear, and feel the scorched earth? Do they want to, watch with horror as some kids walk out of a building with all their skin falling off? What's the, how does it play out? What am I going to do? Tell me, tell me.
It's a fine line then, because then you have sort of the difference between an apocalyptic story and a post-apocalyptic story. So I wrote Risen Gods with Joanna Penn, and Joanna lived in New Zealand for a number of years, and we set the story there because of the active volcanoes in the region.
Yes.
And so that was a more of an apocalyptic story because there was an eruption, and almost the entire story is sort of that critical event and how the people there dealt with it.
Right. Whereas
post-apocalyptic, like we said, that apocalyptic event can take place off the page, and then in the apocalyptic story, I think the more detailed you can be, the better. If you're referencing specific streets or landmarks, historical buildings or structures that people identify or know, in an apocalyptic story, I think that's really important, and people crave that. In the post-apocalyptic, I think it's more about surveying a landscape and giving a generalized sense of what things look like. Like, is this 5 years out? Is it 50 years out? Because what the buildings look like and what the infrastructure looks like is vastly different 5 years than 50 years. There was a great series, I think it was on the Learning Channel maybe 10 years ago. It was called Life After People. and they did these computer simulations of like what would these areas look like if there was no one around. And it was more than just like the natural regrowth, but it was like, well, what if there's no one manning the electric the power plants and the that type of infrastructure, like what would happen? And I found that show absolutely fascinating, and I think that's the kind of thing that in a post-apocalyptic world building scenario that you can bring in, but you really have to understand when and where the story's taking place. Regionally is a big thing too. Like, in Cleveland, Ohio, we get lake effect snow. We get tons of snow. I grew up in Pittsburgh, which is a 2-hour drive away, and the climate's the same, but they don't get nearly as much snow. So even those slight differences can really add some texture to the story, and really exploring those and knowing those as a writer are very helpful.
And you were saying that you still feel that character trumps everything.
I do.
And when I'm reading post-apocalyptic, I do, I have a fascination, being a scientist anyway, have a fascination with, how does that play out and why is that? I'm not nerdy about it, but I can recognize in myself that there's a need for some of it. But if they go on for pages about it, some of Neil Stephenson's books, which I love, but you do get into this massive description of, how this whole thing was constructed. Okay, yeah, but what's happening?
Yeah.
So do you? Is that something, how do you deal with that? What do you just sort of splurge in the first draft and think, okay, well, if I've over-described the apocalyptic landscape, I'll come back and revise? Speak to that if you may.
Sure. I think there's two layers to that. I think on the craft side, I think if you have an editor who you trust, who you've built a relationship with, who knows the type of stories you like to tell, that can be a great check on that. Right. You send that to an editor, and the editor says, wow, this scene is really good, but you need to cut 1,000 words because we don't care what the mountain range looks like with all the trees, third growth trees return, right? So I think that's one layer to it. And then I think the second layer is really about more of the marketing side, which is understanding your reader and what does your reader want. And honestly, that's harder to do when you're starting out because you don't have a back catalog and you don't have a feedback loop directly with those readers. But as you start to publish and as you start to create these stories, you're going to hear and you should ask from those readers, and you have to put it in terms that are very sort of common sense and not writerly. Like, I think we like to geek out as writers, and we like to ask, what was the turning point of that scene? And readers are like, what? I don't know. Like,
but there was a value shift. There must have been.
Yeah, right. It's polarizing. They're like, huh? But like, I think if you ask them questions about like, where did you put the book down, or and then you're going to learn about like where that line is, and how much of that do they want, and how much of it they don't, and then to confuse people even further, you have to put an asterisk on that because sometimes the reader doesn't know what they don't know. And sometimes they're looking to you to set the expectation. So it's complicated. There's no one right answer to it, but I think if you're paying attention to it, both on the craft side and then on the marketing side, you're definitely increasing your chance for success.
Right. And I'm really glad that you mentioned climate and how these multiple layers of setting and world building, because something I've found working with editing and coaching clients is people get very sort of myopic. I have a character, my character sees this, my character touches that, my character moves here and does that. But if you think of watching a movie on the screen, the characters only take up so much of the screen unless you're really zooming in. So while we don't want 3 pages about the trees on the mountains, having 3 sentences might be perfect just to give us a sense of world and place and scope and, that character's place in that world, that sense of perspective and, So, yeah, I'm a big fan of writing climate into stories.
Well, and I think I mentioned last episode that I'm really close to McCarthy's The Road right now because I was working on it. But like that's a great example where, he doesn't waste words where they're not necessary, and to a fault. I mean, if readers are not familiar with it, he doesn't use dialogue tags. He shifts perspective. He doesn't use quotation marks. He doesn't. There's no defined chapters or scene breaks, and yet it's an incredible piece of literature. And he doesn't spend pages and pages and pages describing this post-apocalyptic world because it's character driven, and it's based on this man and his son and what's happening to them. So again, I think if you go back to the masterworks, if you go back to, it doesn't even have to be the bestsellers. It can be the stories that you connect with the most, and deconstruct those. That will help you find that line between, what is necessary world building versus what is excessive world building.
Right. Because very subjective, as you say, because some readers are going to want the big description and some are going to want the more character driven anyway. So I guess, what you're saying is find your own voice with that, but know the genre, but find your own voice.
Right. And looking at the works you love, the ones you're drawn to, will help you find your own balance. Because if you like really spare settings that don't show you much of the world, that's probably the kind of story you're going to write. But if you're looking at successful, well-received works that are spare in terms of setting, you can get a handle on what that means, Yeah,
and I'm highly subjective. I mean, like this, I really believe in being efficient in storytelling. And that's subjective. Like there will be people who disagree, and that's totally fine. But I have a history as a musician, and sort of one of the unspoken rules of being in a band is always leave the audience wanting more. And I've sort of transported that ethos to my writing, in that if there's ever a question, I always err on the side of less rather than more. I would rather have a reader crave more and want to get deeper than sort of tune out because it's too much.
Right.
Good advice.
Very good advice. Yes.
Hard to do though, because you get excited about the story, or you get excited about the technology or the science or the world, and you want to dump all that in there, but you have to remember the reader's perspective and giving. I believe you give them just what they need and no more, and that's the best way to tell the story.
Yeah, well said. I think particularly in speculative fiction, it exists as for me anyway, as a movie in your own mind. And so it's very easy to then meticulously extract that word by word. And as you say, that isn't what the reader wants. They want a story that has pace and that moves, and according to their own expectations anyway. They don't want my movie in my head, sadly.
And that's and then we get into sort of the magical, mystical element of the written word versus other mediums. I mean, I think we're all drawn to books because we are part of we co-create with the author. We're not shown, or we're not hearing the story. We are creating as we're reading, and so I think in that sense, especially, being very efficient is a courtesy to the reader, and it allows them to put their own imaginative spin on it.
I can't. Was it Stephen King who actually said that? He said it's a form of telepathy that suspends time.
Yeah, that's in on writing.
It's clever.
Too, yeah.
It's clever, isn't it? Because when you think about it, it's exactly right. You write these words, and then maybe 10, 15 years in the future, someone's reading those words, and it's creating something in their mind that you started. It's quite bizarre, and that's the trick to the craft, I guess.
Yeah, I agree.
Interesting. I'm gonna cast a vote for more detailed narrative descriptions and world building here, just to put it out there for others who are going, wait, I love description, because if I am reading something, like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein or something, you want to have a sense of a world that you can't relate to outside of that book, right? Like when I look around my house, it doesn't look like their world. My car doesn't look like their vehicles.
Yes.
And so finding that balance point for you and your style, and being neither too much to either extreme. So.
Well, and it goes back to genre too and reader expectations.
Right,
So like
right.
that what I just said would be terrible advice for someone writing space opera, for example. Space opera is a very trendy sci-fi subgenre, and in space opera, you have these stories taking place on ships that don't exist.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to build that world, and you have to be very detailed, and you have to it has to be very science-based, and that reader expects that. So I think it really is about that reader expectation and what you have to deliver as the creator of that story.
Right. And I wasn't disagreeing with either of you, just for the record. I was just casting a vote for
no, I agree.
shifting that slider a little bit the other way sometimes.
Yeah, romance is another example. Like, you don't need to do a ton of world building in romance necessarily. I mean, you can, but that's not why that reader comes to the story. They're not coming for the world necessarily.
Right.
So
yeah. Very true.
And if you made me think, both of you made me think that why we read is to be transported, and whatever it is that attracts you about that particular story premise, then you've got to fulfill that premise. So if I'm going to be in post-apocalyptic, I don't want to be transported necessarily to the romance in that. I want to be transported to the post-apocalyptic survival, because that's why I want to read it. So I suppose you have to think about, how do I do that as a writer? And you said it first, Jay, read in that genre and get a feel for it, and particularly the strains that you love, because they all have subgenres, they all have sub niches. So.
Yeah, and this gets, this is a really nuanced thing, and it's something that I still haven't quite figured out, but I feel like I'm getting better at it, is that world building can be so effective if it's done through dialogue in a way that's really clever, as opposed to narrative. And I think that's where I've done that. And I know writers who are early on in their journey, they want to do the traditional info dump, and they want to tell the reader about the world. But if you can show them through the dialogue, I feel like that's a much more effective way. And it's so much more detailed that way as well.
Mm-hmm. Right.
It's hard though.
Well, yeah. And, besides narrative exposition, which when it goes too far is the info dump, as you said, there's dialogue, but there's also movement and action. So don't forget that your characters are interacting with this world. So instead of saying an ivory-handled hairbrush and silver-backed mirror sat next to the pitcher and wash basin, have your character go pick it up and brush her hair, Just incorporate it into what the character is doing on the page. And clearly I'm leaning toward the historical here.
Well, I'll play to that for you. I wrote a scene today for a story that I'm working on, and the lead character in the scene walked into this cabin and stuck her finger in a hole in the mortar where the cold air was coming in. Mm-hmm. So instead of describing this primitive hut and its dilapidated condition and the fact that they were freezing, I used that one little sentence to show the reader that. And that's hard, and I'm continually working at it, but I think that's the difference between me spending a page describing the cabin versus showing the protagonist trying to block the draft from coming in.
Yeah.
Now, the way I would have done it, so I would have had the two characters come in, and one of them would have said to the other, Susan, these post-apocalyptic cabins have been dilapidated so much. Look, if you look over there, you can see the mortar has holes in it. I think that's the best way to do it.
I really miss central heat. Where is that furnace?
That's right, Dave, because when the EMP exploded about 222 kilometers up in the air, not all of the radiation...
Okay, all right. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was how not to do it, according to Robert Scanlon. Goodness. Well, this has been so much fun, Jay. Thank you for being on the show with us. Do you have any final thoughts you would like to share with our listeners about world building or dystopian and post-apocalyptic fiction?
No, I think, again, the advice we kind of open with is become a super fan of whatever it is you want to write, and that's the best way to figure that stuff out. And And I would also like to thank both of you for indulging me, because this is not the type of conversation my wife or kids like to have with me. So it's great to be able to nerd out with some
good, isn't it? Yeah.
That is why we have the round table, so we can geek out about storycraft every week.
Yeah, I knew you'd like it. Tell me, Jay, as well, give yourself a plug for you and anything that you and Zach are working on as well. So name some series and some books that we can get started with.
Yeah, Baron series is the post-apocalyptic series with the water crisis.
Yep.
War for Earth is alien invasion, and we have the Final Awakening series, which is sort of a vampire post-apocalyptic story. And the easiest way, moltenuniversemedia.com is where we have links to all of those books and series. So if people are interested, they can go there and indulge in the end of the world till their heart's content.
Excellent. And we will also have show notes with links to everything we've mentioned, including your websites and all of the books that have come up in these conversations as well. And Catherine does such a good job of time-stamping everything, so if you need to go back and find one specific topic, it'll be there for you.
Yeah, sad that Catherine couldn't be here. She would have enjoyed this conversation. So I'm sure you're listening, Catherine, so we missed you.
All right, that's it for this week's episode. Thanks again so much, Jay.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.